Welcome to this deep dive. You've sent us a fascinating story, the account of the woman caught in adultery and Jesus writing in the sand. It's one of those stories that feels really familiar, but the more you think about it, the more questions it raises. So let's dig into your source material and see what we can uncover.
It's a story that has really sparked debate and interpretation for centuries. Yeah, there's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
Okay, so the source material sets the scene during the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem. It's a time of celebration, but the source also points out that it's a time when religious tensions are running pretty high. Was that typical for this feast?
Absolutely. The Feast of Tabernacles was a major pilgrimage event. It drew Jews from all over the Roman Empire, and that meant different interpretations of the law, different political viewpoints, a lot more opportunity for friction.
Okay, so the source emphasizes that the Pharisees who brought the woman forward were very strict about following the law, but they also chose a very, very specific moment to confront Jesus, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. The source notes that they interrupt Jesus while he's preaching in the temple, right in the middle of this religiously charged festival. So this wasn't really about upholding the law. It was a deliberate power play, a very public attempt to discredit Jesus.
And the law, as the source reminds us, was pretty clear on the punishment for adultery, stoning. But the source also points out that Roman law forbade Jews from carrying out executions. So were the Pharisees actually intending to carry out the sentence?
That's highly doubtful. It seems more likely that they were just trying to back Jesus into a corner.
Yeah, force him to make a choice.
Exactly. So if he supported the Mosaic law, he'd be defying Rome. But if he showed mercy to the woman, they could accuse him of undermining the law and then potentially turn the crowds against him.
So it's less about justice and more about political maneuvering. The source suggests that the Pharisees might have even staged the whole thing, which is...
Pretty devious.
Yeah, that's pretty devious.
It certainly casts their actions in a different light, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
The source analyzes the Pharisees' own writings from this period, and it seems that there was a lot of internal debate about how strictly to interpret certain laws, particularly ones with capital punishment.
Okay.
So even within their own tradition, there was room for different approaches.
Their hypocrisy seems even more stark when you consider that the source never mentions the man involved in the adultery.
Exactly. It highlights the double standard of the time. And it raises questions about what their true motivation might have been in bringing the woman forward in the first place.
Okay, so the trap is set, everything's in place, but then Jesus does something totally unexpected. He starts writing on the ground. The source dives into various interpretations of this act. Some suggest that he was writing down the accuser's sins, others that he was connecting to Old Testament passages. But what strikes me is how the source emphasizes the silence of this moment.
It's incredibly powerful, isn't it? Imagine the scene. A hushed crowd, tension just hanging in the air, and Jesus seemingly ignoring everybody, focusing on this act of writing in the dirt. He really takes the power away from the Pharisees and creates this space for reflection, for anticipation.
The source describes the Pharisees as becoming increasingly agitated. As the silence drags on, it must have felt like forever to them. What do you think was going on in their minds?
Well, I imagine a whole cocktail of emotions, frustration, confusion, maybe even a flicker of fear. After all, the source mentions that the Pharisees had already tried to stone Jesus earlier in his ministry. They knew that he was capable of challenging them in very unpredictable ways.
And the source points out that Jesus' writing also draws attention to the ground itself, which is interesting given that it's the Feast of Tabernacles.
That's a great point. The source connects the Feast of Tabernacles to the Israelites wandering in the wilderness. They lived in temporary shelters and relied on God's provision for survival. So the ground, the dust, symbolizes both their humility and their dependence on God.
Okay, so Jesus' writing in that context takes on a deeper meaning. It's not just some random act, it's this deliberate connection to the historical and spiritual significance of the feast itself.
Exactly. He's reminding everyone present of their shared history, their shared vulnerability, and really their shared need for God's grace.
And the source also makes a connection to the book of Jeremiah, where it talks about the names of those who reject God being written in the earth.
That's right. The source uses this passage to suggest that Jesus might have been visually representing the fleeting nature of those who focus on judgment and condemnation, rather than on mercy and compassion. It's a chilling thought, isn't it?
It really adds a whole other layer to the story. Jesus isn't just dismissing the Pharisees. He's using their own scriptures to challenge their understanding of God's justice.
And he's doing it in a way that would have resonated deeply with the crowds who were familiar with these passages. It's a brilliant example of how Jesus used familiar concepts to subvert expectations and then reveal these deeper truths.
Yeah, he's definitely not playing by their rules. He's turning the tables completely.
Yeah, he is. And then he speaks. That famous line, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." The source points out how brilliant this response is. He doesn't deny the law,
Right.
but it really throws the focus back onto the accusers themselves.
Yeah, it challenges them to look at their own lives, their own failings, before they go and condemn somebody else. That must have been pretty uncomfortable for them, especially given this very public display of, piety.
Yeah, imagine the weight of that statement in that context.
Yeah.
You're surrounded by all your peers, people that you're supposed to be leading in righteousness, and then suddenly the spotlight's on your own shortcomings. The source suggests that the oldest leaving first isn't just some random detail.
Interesting.
It implies this growing awareness of their own imperfection, maybe even shame.
It's like this ripple effect starting with the people who have had the most time to accumulate, shall we say, life experience. And ultimately, they all leave. So now Jesus is alone with the woman. It's fascinating how the source highlights this shift in the power dynamic.
The Pharisees came to put Jesus on trial.
Yeah.
But in a sense, he put them on trial. And they just couldn't stand under the weight of their own judgment.
Yeah.
It's a really subtle but profound reversal.
And the source points out that Jesus doesn't immediately address the woman. He goes back to writing on the ground. Another one of those pregnant pauses. What do you think is happening in her mind at this point?
Oh, it's hard to say for sure, but I would imagine a whirlwind of emotions. Fear, obviously, knowing the punishment that she was facing, shame, having been exposed so publicly, but maybe also a glimmer of hope, having seen how Jesus has handled her accusers.
And maybe even curiosity about what he's writing. I mean, if I were in her shoes, I'd be like, what is he writing? I would have to know.
I think anyone would be. The source explores this idea that Jesus' silence during these moments is as important as his words.
Okay.
It allows space for the weight of his actions and the truth of his words to sink in.
It's like he's creating this vacuum, drawing everybody's attention to this one essential truth of the situation, which is we are all flawed.
Right.
We are all in need of grace.
It's such a powerful message.
Yeah.
And it's delivered in such a masterful way. And when he finally does speak to the woman, there's no condemnation. He simply asks if anyone has condemned her. And when she says no, he says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more."
Forgiveness, but also a call to change. The source really digs into that last part. Sin no more. It's easy to just kind of gloss over that, but it suggests that there's a deeper transformation that needs to happen.
Absolutely. The source points to the Greek word that's used here, which implies this complete turning away from sin, like a change in direction. It's not just about avoiding this one particular act again. It's about really embracing a new way of life.
So it's not just a get out of jail free card. It's a challenge.
Right.
An invitation to live differently. And it makes me wonder, what was it about Jesus that inspired that kind of change in people?
The source looks into this a bit, looking at how Jesus consistently met people right where they were, with compassion, with understanding, but also with this challenge to move beyond their current circumstances. There's an element of both radical acceptance and radical expectation in his interactions.
It's that blend of grace and truth that seems so compelling. Like he doesn't shy away from the hard stuff, but he also doesn't condemn.
Exactly. And it goes back to that idea of living water that we were talking about earlier. The source suggests that Jesus is not just offering forgiveness, but he's offering a source of spiritual sustenance, a wellspring that can quench this deep thirst of the human heart.
It's like he's saying, I see your brokenness and I'm offering you something more.
And that something more is a relationship with God, a life that's lived in alignment with truth and love. And that makes me think about how we often approach forgiveness today. Do we offer it freely, without conditions? Or do we expect something in return?
That's a really profound question. And I think the source encourages us to wrestle with that. Because in the end, that's what this deep dive is all about, isn't it? It's about taking these ancient stories and finding ways to apply them to our own lives.
It's about letting them challenge our assumptions, our beliefs, and our actions.
And ultimately letting them lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves, of God, and of the world around us.
Okay, so we've explored the setting, the power dynamics, the silence, the forgiveness. But we still haven't cracked the biggest mystery of all. What did Jesus actually write on the ground?
That's the million-dollar question. And unfortunately, the source doesn't give us a definitive answer. But it does provide some really intriguing possibilities.
The source dives into the idea that Jesus might have been using this teaching technique called reams, hinting at or alluding to passages in the Hebrew scriptures. Could you unpack that a little bit for us?
Absolutely. Reams was a common way for rabbis to engage their students, to spark debate, and to lead them to deeper understandings of the text. It was kind of like a puzzle or a riddle,
Okay.
requiring the audience to kind of connect the dots and draw their own conclusions.
So instead of explicitly stating his point, Jesus might have been using this technique to subtly challenge the Pharisees with their own scriptures. The source mentions a few potential connections, like the passage in Jeremiah about names being written in the earth.
That's one possibility,
Yeah.
and a powerful one. It would certainly align with his message about sin and judgment. But the source also explores other options, like references to the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, or even allusions to prophecies about a coming Messiah who would bring justice and mercy to the world.
It's fascinating to think about how this technique would have played out in real time. Like, imagine the Pharisees trying to decipher what he's writing, the crowds buzzing with speculation. It must have been quite the spectacle.
Yeah, it would have been a very different kind of teaching than we're used to today. But it's a reminder that Jesus was a master communicator, and he used every tool at his disposal to reach people.
The source emphasizes how this technique also highlights the importance of context. To really understand what Jesus was doing, you have to consider the historical, the cultural, the religious backdrop of the whole story.
Exactly. You can't just isolate this event
Right,
and try to analyze it in a vacuum.
right.
You have to see it within this larger framework of Jesus's ministry, his teachings, and his interactions with the religious leaders of his day.
And the source also makes the point that RIMS requires active engagement from the audience. It's not just about passively receiving information, it's about wrestling with the text, searching for deeper meaning.
Yeah, it's an invitation to participate in this process of discovery, to become a co-creator of meaning. And in that sense, it's a really empowering approach to learning.
It's like Jesus is saying, I'm not going to spoon feed you the answers. I want you to engage your minds, your hearts, your imaginations to discover the truth for yourself.
And that's a challenge that's still relevant for us today. We can't just passively consume information. We have to wrestle with it, question it, and allow it to transform us.
Yeah, this Reams technique seems particularly relevant when we consider how divisive religious interpretations can be.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like it encourages more dialogue and open-mindedness rather than dogma.
That's a great point. The source suggests that Reams wasn't just about teaching. It was about fostering a culture of respectful debate and intellectual humility.
Okay, so instead of clinging to these rigid interpretations, it encourages a more fluid and dynamic approach to understanding Scripture.
Exactly. It recognizes that there are multiple layers of meaning in the text, and that different perspectives can enrich our understanding.
I love that. It takes the pressure off of having to have all the answers and invites us to engage with the text in a much more humble and curious way.
And it opens up this possibility for dialogue and understanding across different perspectives, which is something that seems especially important in today's world.
Yeah, it reminds me of how the source connects that living water imagery to the Feast of Tabernacles and what that reveals about Jesus's message.
Absolutely. It goes beyond just the physical act of thirst and points to this deeper longing for spiritual fulfillment that we all experience.
Yeah, and the source makes a very compelling argument that for the Jewish people of that time, the Feast of Tabernacles would have evoked that sense of dependence on God, that need for something beyond themselves.
That's right. It wasn't just some historical event. It was a living memory, a reminder of their vulnerability and their need for God's provision.
So when Jesus uses that imagery of living water at this particular feast, it takes on this whole other layer of meaning, right? He's
Right.
tapping into something very deep within their collective consciousness, their shared experience of thirst and satisfaction.
Exactly. And he's offering them something that goes beyond just physical and temporal. He's offering spiritual sustenance, a source of life and renewal that can only be found in a relationship with God.
And the source points out that this message transcends time and culture, right? That longing for something more, that search for meaning and purpose, it's something that resonates with people across the ages.
Yeah, it's a universal human experience. We
Right.
all have that thirst, that emptiness that we're trying to fill. And Jesus is offering himself as the answer, the source of living water that can truly satisfy.
So it's not just a story about an adulterous woman and a bunch of hypocritical Pharisees, right? It's a story about our own search for meaning, our own need for forgiveness, and our own longing for something more.
It's a story about the human condition, and it's a story about God's love for humanity.
So even though we may never know exactly what Jesus wrote on the ground,
The source leaves us with plenty to ponder.
it's an invitation to keep digging, keep searching, and to keep wrestling with those deeper questions of faith and life. And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating.
It really does. It takes a story that we think we know and then reveals these hidden depths, these layers of meaning that we might never have considered before.
It's the kind of stuff that I love to just kind of geek out on, how seemingly simple details can actually be packed with significance.
Yeah, like a puzzle, isn't it? Each piece on its own might not seem like much, but when you start putting them together, you really see the bigger picture.
The source does a really good job of laying out those pieces. The historical context of the Feast of Tabernacles, the political maneuvering of the Pharisees, that theological significance of Reims, and of course that powerful imagery of living water.
Yeah, and it's a reminder that these stories aren't just ancient history. They're still speaking to us today, challenging us, inspiring us, and inviting us to wrestle with those big questions of faith, life, and meaning.
The source makes a point of highlighting the fact that the story took place during a time of great political and religious upheaval. Does that resonate with you at all in today's world?
It absolutely does. I mean, we live in a time where truth is often contested, different ideologies clash, and people are searching for answers to really complex questions. And in the midst of all that, this story reminds us that there's a deeper reality, a source of truth and hope that transcends the chaos of the moment.
It's like this anchor in a stormy sea.
Exactly. And an invitation to step out of the fray and find that place of stillness and clarity where we can connect with something larger than ourselves.
That makes me think about how the source describes Jesus's response to the Pharisees. He doesn't engage in their power games. He doesn't get drawn into their arguments. He simply writes on the ground and creates this space of silence and reflection.
It's such a powerful contrast, isn't it? He's surrounded by all this noise and commotion, yet he remains centered, grounded, connected to a deeper source of wisdom and authority.
And in that silence, he completely dismantles their arguments without even saying a word.
Yeah, it's a masterclass in nonviolent resistance. He's not fighting back. He's not defending himself. He's simply exposing the truth and letting it speak for itself.
It's like he's saying, you can try to trap me with your words, but I'm operating on a different level.
And that level is the level of love, of compassion, of understanding. It's the level where true justice and mercy meet.
This deep dive is really making me rethink how I approach conflict in my own life. Do I get caught up in the back and forth, the need to be right, or can I try to find that place of stillness within myself that allows me to respond with wisdom and grace?
Yeah, those are great questions to consider. And I think the source would encourage us to keep wrestling with them, because in the end, that's how we grow, how we learn, and how we become more like Christ.
It's not about having all the answers. It's about being open to the journey.
And trusting that even when we don't understand, even when we feel lost or confused, there's a deeper truth, a deeper love that's always guiding us.
I love how the source doesn't try to force a specific interpretation of what Jesus wrote on the ground. It lays out the possibilities, explores different angles, but ultimately leaves it open for us to ponder.
Yeah, it's an invitation to engage our own imaginations, our own understanding of Scripture, and our own experiences to draw our own conclusions. And that's what makes it so powerful.
It's not about being told what to think. It's about being empowered to think for ourselves.
And to discover the truth that resonates most deeply within our own hearts.
I gotta say, this whole idea of Reims has really captured my attention. It's such a subtle yet profound teaching technique. I'm definitely going to be looking for it in other passages of Scripture.
Oh, I think you'll find it everywhere once you start looking for it. It's a reminder that the Bible is a living text full of layers of meaning and hidden depths. And it's an invitation to engage with it in a way that's both intellectually stimulating and spiritually enriching.
The source also suggests that Reims can help us bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and modern understanding. Do you think that's true?
Absolutely. It's a way of connecting with the minds and hearts of those who wrote the Scriptures, while also recognizing that their words can speak to us in fresh and relevant ways today. It's about finding that timeless truth that transcends cultural and historical boundaries.
So it's not about trying to force the Bible into a modern mold. It's about allowing it to speak to us in our own language, our own context.
Exactly. And I think That's what makes this story of the adulterous woman so compelling. It's an ancient story, but it deals with these timeless themes of sin, judgment, forgiveness, and redemption. And it challenges us to think about how those themes play out in our own lives today.
The source points out that the Pharisees were so focused on the letter of the law that they completely missed the spirit of the law. They were so concerned with outward appearances that they neglected the inward transformation that true religion is all about.
It's a cautionary tale, isn't it? It reminds us that we can get so caught up in rules and regulations that we lose sight of the heart of the matter. And that's a danger that's always present no matter what our religious or spiritual beliefs may be.
Yeah, it's so easy to fall into that trap of thinking that we're better than others, that we're more righteous, that we've got it all figured out.
But this story reminds us that we're all in need of grace. We all make mistakes. We all have blind spots.
It's a call to humility, to compassion, and to a deeper understanding of what it means to truly love God and love our neighbor.
And it's a reminder that forgiveness is not just about wiping the slate clean. It's about offering a path to transformation. It's about helping people to turn away from sin and embrace a new way of life.
This deep dive has really challenged me to think about how I approach forgiveness in my own life. Do I offer it freely, without conditions? Or do I hold on to grudges? Let resentment fester?
Those are tough questions to ask ourselves, but they're essential if we want to grow and mature in our faith. And I think the source would encourage us to be gentle with ourselves as we wrestle with these things. It's a process, not a destination.
It's about taking one step at a time, one act of forgiveness at a time, and trusting that God's grace will meet us where we are.
And as we extend that grace to others, we'll find that it's also extended to us. It's a beautiful cycle of healing and transformation.
So even though the source doesn't give us a definitive answer to the mystery of what Jesus wrote on the ground, it leaves us with a really powerful message of hope and possibility.
Yeah, a message that speaks to the deepest longings of the human heart. Our need for forgiveness, our desire for meaning, and our search for a love that can truly transform us.
And it's an invitation to keep digging, keep exploring, and keep asking those big questions that lead us closer to the heart of God.
Because in the end, that's what faith is all about. A journey of discovery, a lifelong adventure of seeking and finding.
Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with me. It's been a real eye-opener. I hope our listeners found it just as engaging and thought-provoking.
It's been a pleasure. And remember, the journey doesn't end here. There's always more to discover, more to learn, and more to experience in this vast and mysterious landscape of faith.
So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking that living water that will truly quench your thirst.
Until next time.